Oh, no,
Is it gonna behave now? It appears to be about 7 o'clock, and it looks like the clock is finally behaving itself. So if it starts acting goofy, somebody tell me, but I'll assume that it's the correct time for now. Well, thank you all very much for coming back. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me that people are interested in this material. Oh, I got to turn the, sorry about this. What we're going to focus on tonight is 1964 and 65, with a little bit of 1963 because I did not finish all the material from last week. Let's test 1, 2, test 1, 2. How's that? Can people hear okay? Is that an okay level of volume? Okay, if I start, if you can't hear, just set up some kind of signal. So what I'm going to do tonight is finish up one section from 1963 that I didn't get to. That is the story of the adoption of the Fair Housing Code, the first the first Fair Housing Code in the state of Wisconsin in 1963. Then we'll go into 1964-65 and pick up with what happens in urban renewal and civil rights there. We talked a bit about the impact in the last 2 weeks of the fact that there is no state, federal, or local ordinance or statute preventing discrimination in housing. So as a result, non-whites in Madison have access to about 24% of the housing in the city, which makes it terribly difficult to relocate people, the non-whites from the bush when urban renewal comes along. Notwithstanding that, Fair Housing Code was not a big deal locally in 1962 or 63. Lloyd Barbie, on behalf of the NAACP, had proposed something in early 1962. It never went anywhere. There was legislation pending in the state legislature that everyone on the local level assumed, well, the state of Wisconsin will pass a fair housing statute, so we don't have to worry about it locally. So as the mayoral campaign of 1963 begins, it's not a big issue. But in 1962, a citizens group does form. There are a lot of citizens groups forming for fair housing advocacy across the country. We've got in Madison the Wisconsin Citizens for Fair Housing, the Greater Madison unit. The chairwoman is Virginia Hart. Virginia Hart would become the first woman in Wisconsin to be a department head. She was the head of the Labor and Industry Review Commission under Pat Lucy. But this time she's what would be described as a faculty wife. Her husband is Professor Henry Hart, and Virginia is very active in the League of Women Voters and fair housing. And we see more requests for a local ordinance. The chair of the Madison chapter of the NAACP, the Mayor's Commission on Human Rights, is the Reverend Richard Pritchard, who we spoke about, and he's advocating that something has to happen, and these local groups start planning their own advocacy. And I cannot stress this enough, how much the drive for a fair housing code was generated by citizen activists. There are no aldermen on the council that were pushing this. Mayor Henry Reynolds would come around to support it, but the drive for a fair housing code came entirely from citizen activists. And that is one of the hallmarks of this part of the decade. And I think one of the reasons why those of us who came along a little bit later in the decade thought that citizen activists would get stuff done. Sure, we can stop the war by protesting. Look at what our parents did. Our parents created the Fair Housing Code. Our parents, on the other side of the equation, may have stopped the Monona Terrace through referendum. And the role of citizen activism in the early 1960s is one of the hallmarks of that age, and how successful it was. So the mayoral campaign of 1963 comes along. It's not a big issue, but the NAACP and the Mayor's Commission are pressing it. Henry Reynolds actually lived in an integrated neighborhood. Mayor Henry Reynolds' house on East Mifflin Street was in one of the few integrated neighborhoods. But he didn't really favor a fair housing code. One of the great black activists, black professionals of the time was Harry Hamilton. He was a member of the Mayor's Commission on Human Rights. He was a professor of organic chemistry. His wife, Velma Hamilton, was a teacher at MATC and has a school named after her. So Velma and Harry Hamilton were certainly very high up in the academic and social world of Madison. And Henry Reynolds tells Harry Hamilton, quote, "If we can accomplish fair housing with brotherly love, this is the way it should be done. You don't want to live where you're not wanted, do you?" Now this is from somebody who would eventually come around to be the most important supporter of fair housing, and he's saying to Harry Hamilton, well, you don't want to live where people don't want you. It's an extraordinary thing to read, but that was the attitude of the time. The mayor and the NAACP officials finally start meeting. Marshall Colston is very upset that Henry Reynolds seems to be ignoring the whole drive for fair housing. He says there's arrogance and apathy and indifference by the city of Madison toward non-whites. It's been 18 months since Lloyd Barbie proposed the NAACP's ordinance. Nothing has happened. Finally, so the realtors, the leaders of NAACP and the realtors disagree. The Madison Board of Realtors led the fight against the Fair Housing Code. Nationwide, the National Board of Realtors led the fight against federal legislation, and locally, the local realtors led the fight against fair housing. The president of the Madison Board of Realtors is a man named Earl Espeseth. He is a member of the Madison Housing Authority, and he's going to become the chairman of the Madison Housing Authority. The chairman of the Madison Housing Authority was against the Fair Housing Code. That, to me, I cannot imagine that in modern Madison we would have, as a member of the Housing Authority or a member of the Redevelopment Authority, somebody who essentially favored discrimination in housing. But Earl Espeseth, on behalf of the Realtors, did. And the executive vice president of the Realtors says, there's no problem. The NAACP is making a big hullabaloo out of nothing. People have a right to sell their property or lease their property to whoever they want. The groups start planning this drive, and now all attention turns to the city attorney, Edwin Conrad. Does the city even have the legal authority to enact a fair housing code? Do we have the authority to have such an ordinance? And Edwin Conrad, who would go on to be a member of the city council for a term before dying midterm, goes all the way back to the Civil War to find legal authority for a municipal fair housing code. He says, the meaning of the Civil War and the reason for the Union dead at Gettysburg is to foster equality. And with that background, obviously, the city has the jurisdiction. As a legal analysis, I think it's kind of results-oriented, but you know, we got the job done, and we decided, and he decided that we did have the authority. Now so he does the initial drafting, and the main draftsperson on behalf of the advocates, a member of the Mayor's Commission for Human Rights, a young attorney with the LaFollette, Sinnick and Doyle Anderson firm, is the primary drafter on behalf of the advocates. That's Shirley Abrahamson. So, to me, this is another signal of why Madison in the 60s was a special place. A woman of statewide historic significance. The first female justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, the first female chief justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, was a member of the Mayor's Commission on Human Rights and drafted our Equal Opportunities Ordinance. That to me is a pretty big deal. Here we see her with her Irish setters, Betsy B. and Briscoe, named after the Jewish mayor of Dublin who had been active in Sinn Féin. The little things, the wormholes you go down to when you're trying to find out about stuff.
Do you know when she was elected to the...
Pat Lucey appointed her to the Supreme Court in 1977, and then she would have been elected to 3 10-year terms. But she was served on the Supreme Court from 77 to just recently. Yes, Steve?
She lived on Winona Way when she was first appointed, and must have worked at least 12-hour days. She was a workaholic. Yeah. And just like in this picture, 15 years later, she'd get off work on a summer night at 8 o'clock, and she'd walk down the street in her high heels. I never saw her walking without her high heels.
This photo is from when she was hired by the LaFollette Sinnick firm as, you know, lady lawyer. I mean, it's 1962. It was a big deal. And they had this whole photo spread of Shirley walking the dogs, Shirley in the law library, Shirley cooking dinner. And Shirley has this box of minute rice and she's dressed like Donna Reed. She's got pearls and she's got, you know, her high heels, and she's looking at the directions assiduously. It's like, okay, 3 minutes. Shirley, it's minute rice. Come on, it's minute rice. Yeah, God love Shirley.
This book is well researched.
Wasn't Pat Lucey, wasn't he Republican?
No, Pat Lucey was a Democrat through and through. Pat Lucey was the chairman of the state Democratic Party. Pat Lucey, we'll see Pat Lucey in a couple episodes. No, Pat Lucey was a Democrat every day of his life. So here's another example of this amazing citizen activism. The Madison Citizens for Fair Housing putting a newspaper ad. 2,000 people signed this ad with their names and addresses. And that could have been some kind of signal to some aldermen. We got 2,000 people who believe strongly enough in fair housing. We're putting our names and our addresses on the line. Pay attention. You see down there Mrs. Keith Simon. Today we would call her Mary Louise Simon. Back then she was Mrs. Keith Simon and would go on to be the first woman to be chair of a county board in Wisconsin. At this time she's one of the advocates for fair housing. So this absolutely sweeping fair housing ordinance, not just fair housing, it bans discrimination in housing, in employment, in public accommodations. And as drafted, it even bans discrimination in all activities licensed by the city. Licensed by the cities. Liquor licenses, parade permits. The ordinance, as Edwin Conrad drafted it, did apply to liquor licenses. Unfortunately, the Commission on Human Rights, that was the committee that everything was referred to, thought that would impose double jeopardy on people to have, I can't really explain their thinking because I don't understand it. They thought that regulating licenses was excessive and they took that part of the ordinance out. That would come back to haunt the city in just a few years. So the city attorney puts licenses and permits in, the Mayor's Commission on Human Rights takes it out. In November, the State Assembly, oh yeah, sorry.
What is it, this is difficult.
Yeah.
What is it ban discrimination on?
Oh, I'm sorry, race, creed, the traditional ones, race, color, creed, ancestry, religion. You know, the main five of the era. So on November 7th, the State Assembly, which is controlled as all levels of state, I'm sorry, there's a Democratic governor at this point, but the Assembly is Republican. The Republican State Assembly kills all the fair housing bills. It defeats the fair housing statute by 2-1. In 1963, the Wisconsin State Assembly defeated a fair housing code by better than 2-1. So that's the point that the Mayor's Commission and the citizen activists really gear up. The only person not to vote for it at the Mayor's Commission level was a Republican attorney named Carol Metzner. Some of you will recognize that name. Carol Metzner was the Republican attorney who served one term in the Assembly, and in 1957 got the state to pass a law setting a height limit at Law Park in order to kill the Frank Lloyd Wright Monona Terrace. That was Carol Metzner's legacy to Wisconsin, and he's the only person not to vote for the Fair Housing Code at the Mayor's Commission. He says people can do with their property what they want. But all the citizen activist groups support it. And what John McGrath, the chairman of the Mayor's Commission on Human Rights, and Betty McDonald, the secretary, have done, they've created this thing called the Tuesday Night Committee, which is all the citizen activists. The Citizens Commission for Human Rights and the Fair Housing Ordinance and all these little groups, and they are supporting it. So we've got this tremendous amount of public support just from rank and file citizen activists. It goes to the council. And here's an example of what the realtors are doing. That advertised in the upper left-hand corner, the realtors are calling this forced occupancy legislation. So this is the anti-fair housing activism by the man who is the member and soon to be chairman of the Madison Housing Authority, who runs our public housing. You can see the mayor is strongly supporting it. Church leaders are strongly supporting it. Our old friend Babe Rohr decides to speak up. Babe Rohr says, there's no problem, and quote, this isn't going to get a colored man a place to live, and it isn't going to do him any good either. I say there's no problem, but there will be if this is passed. He predicts it will fail, as does the council president, Richard Cobb. You see the mayor being celebrated. That's Mary Louise Simon to your left, to his right. Of course, at the time she was Mrs. Keith Simon, but we know her as Mary Louise. So, yeah.
Rohr said it would set the Negro back 20 years.
This is yes, thank you.
Could you say more about that argument he was making?
No, because it makes no sense. You know, it's just, they had to come up with some kind of word salad because they couldn't say, I don't want the coloreds living next to me. So they had to come up with some kind of quasi-rationale, which doesn't make sense, but it's what they said publicly. So, we get to the count. Okay. In this era, up until 1970, the council met twice a week. On Tuesdays, they met as the Committee of the Whole, and on Thursdays, they met as the council. In the Committee of the Whole, on Tuesdays, they had the debate, they took a preliminary vote, and then they had the main debate, the main vote, the binding vote on Thursday. So it was a completely different way of doing business. Usually, the Tuesday night votes held, but sometimes votes would change. So, Tuesday night, December 10th, 1963, it is United Nations Human Rights Day. What an auspicious day to debate the Fair Housing Code. 400 people come to the city council. I've talked each night about how the level of citizen activism. 400 people come to the city council. And again, the population of Madison is essentially half of what it is today. Think of a city council debate, a 6-hour city council debate that would bring 800 people in to watch the proceedings. unimaginable. At the level of, I don't know what it was, but people believed that showing up mattered, and paying attention mattered, and their being there mattered. So here we see Pat Lucy, semi-hidden. There's Mary Louise Simon, the Reverend James C. Wright, and Betty McDonald and John McGrath from the Mayor's Commission, and Harry Hamilton at the end of the row. I don't know who this guy is, but he's given us a great look. So this is the night that, this is the committee of the whole meeting. This is when they are going to debate and vote on the Fair Housing Code. Earl Espeseth, as on behalf of the Board of Realtors, comes and says people can take care of this on a voluntary basis. We don't need ordinances. We can do it voluntarily. Pat Lucy comes and says Negroes have been the victims of a vicious and effective conspiracy, a disgrace for which we must all share the guilt. Pat Lucy was the only realtor in the city of Madison to come and support the Fair Housing Code. Big, as I say, 400 people. Everything is going really well. All the people that John McGrath and Betty McDonald have arranged to be there on behalf of the Tuesday night group, everyone is speaking on behalf of the ordinance, and they're dominating debate. Then somebody from the Congress for Racial Equality, CORE, one of the students from the CORE chapter on campus, says, well, even if you pass this ordinance, we're still going to do testing. We're going to send out white testers and black testers just to make sure that the ordinance is being followed. Tactically, not a good move. One of the co-chairmen of CORE says, no, we're not going to do the testing. We trust the ordinance. Dick Kopp says, I don't think the residents of any ward have to answer to a group of university students on anything. They call for just a show of hands at the end of the night. 198 people support the ordinance, 68 oppose it. So we get to the vote, and the City Council of the City of Madison votes 12 to 10 to kill the Fair Housing Code. Delete it entirely. Most of the support comes from conservatives, which the Wisconsin State Journal finds very amusing, because 5 of the aldermen whom the Capital Times had endorsed, mainly labor aldermen, Babe Rohr, Ellsworth Swenson, Leo Cooper, all voted against it. And this is at a time when the AFL-CIO is supporting fair housing codes nationwide. But in Madison, and this will be developed a little further, the Madison construction workers are so against it, the Federation of Labor opposed the Fair Housing Code. The Fair Housing Code dies. It's defeated. There's no, the City Council and the Committee of the Whole defeats it. Now, supporters have